An analysis of the voting gender gap. Since the 19th Amendment was approved by the United States Senate on June 4, 1919, which granted women the right to vote, women have entered the political voting sphere and increasingly contributed to politics. Although some states gave women the right to vote before the 19th Amendment, it wasn't ratified into law federally until 1920. Following the 19th Amendment and enfranchisement of women, women voted at much lower rates than men but split their votes across party lines at the same rate than men. By the later 21st century, women voted at higher rates than men but no longer voted equally across party lines. Since 1980, women have become more left-wing and more likely to vote/support Democrats. This wasn't always the case, and around the 1980s is when this voter gender gap was first pronounced and stirred debate/research. In terms of left-wing, female voters were more likely to favor a larger government and social safety net, as well as more likely to support increased spending on government-provided education, housing, healthcare, and childcare when compared to men. Since many of the recent presidential elections were won with very thin margins, this gender voting gap and how it affects politics are very important towards the political outcomes and policies this country implements. Some narratives early on were that women voted how their husbands voted, or that race/social class/immigration were more the deciding factor. However, studies using area by time variation analyzed how women's enfranchisement affected certain political positions and policies that women voted on, revealed that women's primary considerations and concerns when voting were redistribution and child welfare. This makes more sense as women's role in society at the time was staying at home and raising the children. Women slightly favored the Republican Party compared to men after women's enfranchisement, up into the 60s where it evened out, and switching to favoring the Democrat Party in the 80s. Quote, "This gender gap in vote choice diminished in the 1960s and 1970s, but re-emerged in a different form in 1980. 1980 marked the beginning of the modern gender gap. Since 1980, women voters have been more likely than men to identify as liberal and to vote for Democrats." Unquote. Analyzing the available data, polls, and voting records for the time, we can establish a change in voting behavior between sexes over the years. Quote, "We show that the female-male sex gap in voter turnout grew substantially over the last 80 years, from a deficit of almost 10 percentage points in 1940 to a surplus of over 4 percentage points in the 2016 election. This shift has been driven primarily by an increase in women's relative turnout across cohorts, which we find is associated with the accompanying rise in education, particularly high school graduation, and we show that the sex gap in identification with the Democratic Party rose from roughly parity in the late 1940s to almost 12 percentage points in 2017, unquote. Female voters started to outnumber male voters, and women started to shift towards the Democratic Party at the same time. Traditionally, the two main explanations for this ever-increasing gender voting gap were the classic nature versus nurture argument. Scholars from the nature argument propose that biological differences between genders and genetics are the reasons for the differences in voting behaviors and policy positions between sexes. Whereas nurture proponents claim gender role socialization is what shapes the political preferences of each gender and gender differentiation beginning at childhood that is upheld by society as the reason for political differences between sexes. Both arguments are certainly factors to consider and analyze when trying to explore the root causes of this gender voting gap. However, there are other factors to consider and explore that also encompass this nature versus nurture argument. Since the issue is complex and many variables are involved, examining the factors that had the greatest impact on the gender voting gap is the right approach towards examining the issue. One potential factor that contributes to this gender gap is biological differences between sexes. Using scientific data from the field of biology, political scientists have implemented those findings into the political behavior of the sexes. Quote, "These biological studies suggest our DNA may influence the development of political characteristics, such as party identification." Unquote. These studies have found biological differences between the sexes as a possible reason for the gender voting gap. Women favor a larger government and more social safety nets when compared to men, as they are biologically more nurturing and react to external stimuli in a different way than men do. Quote, women tend to respond to external stimuli less aggressively than men. They also tend to behave in ways characterized as more nurturing and conciliatory. Unquote. Natural selection and mate choice of women has historically favored violent fathers and behavior, an extreme example being Genghis Khan, who was violently ruthless in his conquest across Asia and fathered so many kids that 8% of Asian men are suspected to be descendants of his. Natural selection also favored women who were adept. Women are the ones to carry the baby for 9 months, birth it, and primarily raise the child until maturity. Because of this burden, there is, quote, a sex-based difference called parental investment, Bateman, 1948. This is physically the case, even when contemporary parental arrangements ensure that it is not socially so. Unquote. The idea that the success of the offspring and increasing its survivability depends upon a more nurturing and compassionate mother in a more maternal role. In opposition to men, quote, female violence decreases the likelihood of reproductive success. Unquote. These same characteristics and behaviors that were beneficial for human evolution are possible explanations for the difference in policy positions and voting behavior between men and women today. There is also a physical size and muscle/strength difference between sexes called sexual dimorphism, which makes violence from males to females dangerous to the female. A biological root for these sex differences is prevalent across the animal kingdom, most notably female primates, displaying the same characteristics as female humans in a society without institutions and constructs. This leads to the idea that biology is a major factor in differences between sexes that leads to a difference in politics and voting behavior. Another potential factor that contributes to the gender gap is sociological and the difference in socialization between sexes in society, specifically gender role socialization, which is what society considers masculine or feminine. This made certain roles in society gendered. Quote, in contemporary society, we associate pacifism and compassion with women and aggression and individualism with men. Unquote. Because of gender role socialization in behavior and treatment between sexes in society, children are being affected by these societal and cultural norms or beliefs. Children can differentiate between sexes as infants and toddlers possess the ability to determine their sex. Quote, they become motivated to behave like other members of their own sex and to engage in activities associated with members of their sex. Unquote. Because of gender role socialization and the different behaviors and roles expected between sexes by society, children are conforming and affected by these beliefs and attitudes. Quote, the characteristics inculcated in women through gender role socialization may explain many of the systematic patterns evident in gender gaps. Women tend to express more support for social welfare programs and social welfare spending. Unquote. Since women are more feminist-oriented than men and have a particular group identity that goes along with the feminist movement, they are more likely to support political policies and social issues pertaining to liberal political positions. Feminist consciousness consists of the idea that women are not equal in society and social structures should be changed to better remove gendered roles in society. Quote, these societal changes may require substantial reform of traditional social institutions, and feminists express willingness to use government to alleviate these inequalities. Conover and Sapiro, 1993. Unquote. Women are more likely than men to live in poverty, leading to a knowledge gap between sexes, where men possess more political knowledge. Although this political knowledge gender gap may be magnified by how knowledge was measured, female voters are also increasingly getting younger and more politically active when compared to their predecessors. Quote, the relative rise in women's turnout is largely explained by the replacement of older, low participation cohorts with younger, high participation cohorts. Unquote. Western Europe is also experiencing a similar political gender gap like the one prevalent in America. Women voters are increasingly joining the left-leaning party, as theorized by Engelhardt and Norris, 2000, 2003, where rich developed societies with institutions and societal structures being challenged experience female voters shifting towards the left-wing party. Possible variables that contribute towards this gap are the increase in educational levels of women, increase in the female labor participation rate, and the changing of the family unit structure. Engelhardt and Norris broke down a process that is organized into 3 phases explaining the theory of gender realignment. Quote, "The first phase is known as the traditional gender gap, where women overwhelmingly supported conservative parties. In the next step, gender-based differences in voting behavior decreased and became essentially insignificant. The term used to describe this phase is gender de-alignment. The term modern gender gap describes the third phase, in which women offer disproportionate support to the left side of the political spectrum." Unquote. During the 1950s and 60s, in countries like Sweden, Switzerland, and the Netherlands, female voters were more conservative than male voters, possibly because of higher rates of religious women and their role in society and the household. An increase in the labor force participation rate of women has been impactful towards the gender gap, as well as aligning with feminist consciousness and the idea of financial independence. This increased participation rate raised women's political sovereignty and created a situation where single and divorced women were financially affected differently when compared to married women, the former being more likely to support redistribution of wealth and a larger social safety net. Quote, "It becomes rational for a woman to increase her outside option by investing in her general education and by supporting parties on the left that guarantee to her well-functioning welfare state services." Unquote. In terms of cross-national scale in Western Europe, the largest contributing factor towards the gender voting gap found was the increase in the female labor force participation rate. Acceptance of divorce by society and the increasingly high divorce rate, 50% U.S. divorce rate, has led to women favoring left-wing parties whose policies consist of larger government and redistribution positions. With divorce being so common, women are favoring policies that offer increased assistance that benefit them when they are in a situation where they must rely solely on their own income. Quote, "At the individual level, young and highly educated women have better outside options, but the characteristics of the economy and the labor market determine the scope of outside options." Unquote. This gender gap is the largest in states with the highest rates of divorce, leaving the males less supportive of Democrats and females more supportive of Democrats. The high divorce rate has increased the rate of single mothers who rely on government assistance and child support/alimony from the father, incentivizing women to support policies that would benefit single mothers as the probability they will become one is high. Following women's enfranchisement in the 1920s, when women were allowed to vote and joined the political sphere, the growth of government began simultaneously. The United States was historically persistent with their government expenditures until the 1920s, where, quote, "World War I was the first war after which per capita government expenditures did not return to their pre-war levels," unquote. Granting women the right to vote increased the size and scope of the government and its expenditures over time. Early women voters identified with political parties at the same rate as men, but still voted for policies that benefited their position in society at the time, particularly redistribution of wealth and government assistance for childcare. Quote, "Allowing women to vote is estimated to raise total expenditure and revenue by 13.5 and 10.4%. On average in our sample," unquote. Women have been voting at the state level in various states since 1869 through 1920, when the 19th Amendment was ratified into federal law. Women were still impacting and participating in local and state politics before the federal right for women to vote was enacted. Quote, "Women's suffrage thus produced a much more liberal Congress, which should have contributed to a larger federal budget," unquote. Undoubtedly, the 19th Amendment transformed politics from the moment it was enacted, and granting women the right to vote has greatly shaped the political landscape and government of America. The growth of government has been persistent with the enfranchisement of women and continued to increase with the rate of women joining the political force, leading to more liberal Senate and House positions. Also, the ever-increasing rate of single motherhood in America has made female voters more likely to support left-wing parties and positions, particularly policies that focus on childcare and government assistance. Quote, "The gender gap in part arises from women's fear that they are being left to raise children on their own, and the continued breakdown of the family and higher divorce rates imply growing political conflicts between the sexes." Unquote. Data from Pew Research Center analysis of 2010 to 2018 census and survey data displays that the United States has the world's highest rate of children under 18 who live in single-parent households, sitting at around 23%. Women have increasingly been more likely to get divorced and end up raising a child by herself due to the high divorce rates and world's largest single motherhood rates. Statistics from the Census Bureau, collected throughout the years, indicate that the rate of children living with an unmarried mother has increased from around 10% in 1968 to around 24% today. In every election since 1996, the majority of women have voted Democrat, compared to the majority of men last voting Democrat in 1976. There are many factors and variables that impact the gender voting gap in America and abroad. Most notably the following, which had the greatest effect on the gender gap: biological differences between sexes, sociological differences, feminist consciousness, increased educational levels in women, high divorce rate, high single motherhood rate, changing of culture/societal structure, and political knowledge gap. These slew of factors led to this ever-widening voting gender gap and political differences between the sexes. With more women attending and graduating college, the high divorce rate, the increasing rate of children living in single-parent households, and the role of women in society changing, this gap will only widen and cause further political problems between the sexes.